David Wirth of Boston College Law School, formerly of the State Department Ministry of Foreign Affairs, negotiator of numerous environmental treaties, and a real pleasure to have him with us tonight. Would love to give the floor to Professor David Wirth so that he can make this fantastic presentation. I just want to also mention, we cannot see or hear you in the audience, 325 amazing human beings that are with us tonight. If you would like to leave a question, please do so in the Q&A, or you can do so in the chat. Nós não podemos ver a vocês, pero se vocês querem fazer uma pergunta ou sobre a Q&A ou com o bate-papo, por favor. Quero introduzir Professor David Wirth, please.
Well, thank you, Susan, and thank you, Pedro, for that gracious introduction. I don't speak Portuguese, but I think I got the basic idea, and I'm very humble, and I hope I live up to your expectations in this presentation. It occurred to me right before this webinar began that I have never been to South America. It's the only continent apart from Antarctica that I have not been to. I do have plans to teach a short course through the Hague Academy of International Law in Asunción in Paraguay next spring. So if we have any participants from Paraguay, a special welcome to you, and definitely do stop by for that course. So Susan and Pedro asked me to speak about the current situation with respect to climate change. And I hope you can see my screen.
We can. Mm-hmm.
Sure, perfect.
All right. So this presentation is, as you will see, absolutely up to the minute, including through the G7 meeting, which just concluded literally yesterday.
So muda momento, 1 second, David. So Professor Vir presenta a sua apresentação é do último momento, com os últimos cambiamentos de ayer e esta manhã também. Go ahead, Professor Wirth.
And what I would like to do, because climate is a very complicated issue, is first of all to bring you up to date on the science. Second, to discuss the Paris Agreement, which is the major international instrument that governs climate change throughout the world, including all of South America, and also to bring it home to you, and as you will see, to me, in my personal experiences based on consumer choices.
Perfeito. Ok, Susan, então a apresentação do professor David, extremamente atualizada, ela está atualizada até hoje de manhã, com temas que ele vai desenvolver e expor o problema, falar do Tratado de Paris e as escolhas dos consumidores, né? Seria a eletricidade verde, né? A eletricidade limpa, veículos elétricos e o que ele vai chamar de offsets do clima, ou seja, as compensações climáticas. And Professor David, I like very much this phrase you quoted. This is very strong when you say the future ain't what it used to be. This is very strong. For sure, I totally agree. And this is something that we should be aware, and this is very strong for us to think about this. Eu coloco a importância dessa frase, o futuro não é o que isso estava, ou seria, ou era, e realmente se mostra muito forte para que a gente possa desenvolver isso à luz das mudanças climáticas. Professor David.
Yes, for those of you who aren't aware of who he is, this fellow Yogi Berra was a famous baseball player and coach who was noted for strange twisting of the language that actually captures some realities that are true in everyday life.
Oh, no,
and
okay.
New York Yankee, whoop, whoop.
Okay.
My hometown.
We're here in Boston, so we don't like Yankees.
I know, but that's too bad.
All right. So this This issue has been around for quite a long time. It burst on the policy scene in the mid-80s. In fact, I wrote this article in 1989. I have had occasion to refer to it many times, and for better or worse, not very much has changed. We are still facing the threat of climate change, and the world as a whole has not done very much about it.
Professor Wirth, this typecast, this typeface looks familiar. Where was this published?
It was published in a magazine called Foreign Policy, and the goal was to reach the establishment foreign policy community within the United States to alert them to the problem, which it did because it was followed by any number of subsequent pieces by the counsel, the lawyer to the president himself.
Just to highlight something, that's something very strong. When we see this text you have written, Professor David, in 1989, can we say before this moment when you started talking about this, was this something that scholars were researching at that moment, or that is something very new you were bringing up and highlighting the problem?
The problem of climate change was understood to scientists for some time, but it began to be a public policy issue, and an important one, around the mid-1980s. So in fact, the United Nations responded by creating a group of scientists from around the world, consisting of literally thousands of scientists, called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which published its first report in 1990. As you will see, almost all of the sources that I have here come from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, otherwise known as the IPCC. So the science that I'm presenting here is well accepted. It has been vetted. It has been considered by literally thousands of scientists. And in fact, one of the criticisms of the IPCC is that it sometimes tends to understate the problem. So everything that you're looking at here, you should understand to be a consensus report, a consensus view of scientists, but one that is not necessarily, there are scientists on both sides, including some who think that the problem is much more severe.
Okay, então, just a quick translation, and essa preocupação que o professor David traz é uma preocupação, e eu chamei a atenção do momento em que foi isso escrito. É óbvio que a questão climática é uma questão que se discute há muito tempo entre os cientistas, mas esse foi um momento importante onde ele resgata e traz isso com uma questão de política pública. Então, realmente, é uma preocupação que existia naquele momento e ainda continua. A preocupação ela continua com uma gravidade maior ainda nos dias atuais. Então, essa foi o meu destaque que eu fiz aí, especialmente no momento em que ele escreveu que ele desenvolveu esse trabalho em 1989. Okay, Susan, any observation, or we can?
A única observação é que o professor Wirth quer sublinhar que o problema pode ser muito mais problemático do raporto, porque é sempre arrivato da consenso. E o consenso, em certos casos, não clarifica o nível específico, o tal grande nível do problema sempre, por razões de compromissar com os outros científicos que querem, por razões políticas, não exclamar muito mais o problema. So.
All right. So this slide shows what I assume most participants in this webinar already know. The climate is changing, temperatures are rising, and one of the principal consequences of that is sea level rise. Contrary to some popular understandings, not just because of the melting of the Antarctic ice sheets, but also because water, as the temperature increases, in fact, takes up more room.
Ok. O que esse quadro mostra é realmente uma realidade que todos já conhecem, é o aumento da temperatura global e, com isso, o aumento do nível do mar. E isso é algo que já se falava desde aquele momento, todos já sabem essa problemática da questão do aumento da temperatura média global da superfície da Terra. David.
All right, and this is just to tell you what, again, is common knowledge around the world at this point. Temperatures are increasing, and precipitation as well, that is rain, snow, other forms of water falling out of the sky, is also increasing. So I think I'll move to the next slide before more translation, if that's all right. This slide shows the progression of temperature since the Industrial Revolution, when we as a species began emitting more and more of these gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and a variety of others. So if you look at where we are now, and I checked right before this presentation, we are at an average increase in global temperature of approximately 1.2 degrees Celsius.
Muito impressionante, professor Wirth.
Okay.
Just to highlight this, Professor, esse quadro mostra realmente a problemática do aumento da temperatura média da Terra, inclusive das precipitações, e o aumento médio da temperatura em 1,2 graus Celsius. É impressionante esse crescimento que ele mostra no gráfico aqui. Ok, thank you, Professor David. You can keep up.
It's a little terrifying.
Yes.
Well, and then to move on to effects that are less well appreciated. One is the effect on agriculture. And some countries, such as Canada and the Russian Federation, have said, wow, this is something that is good for us if we have a cold climate, but not necessarily so. The effects are unevenly distributed and quite unpredictable.
E ele passa a falar agora dos aspectos dos efeitos na agricultura. Ok.
Did you want to highlight these, Professor Wirth, these particular details?
Well, I think that the slide is probably enough. Just one particular point. I happen to be speaking to you from the state of Vermont. I'm about to teach a summer class here. It will be my 30th year. When I first started coming to Vermont, just to highlight one aspect here, the ticks were thought generally not to be a problem. They carry disease. In the United States, they carry Lyme disease. The thought was that the climate here was just too cold. In the 30 years that I've been coming here, I have seen personally that the number of ticks has increased from 0 to quite a large number. So these are effects that are oftentimes unpredictable and ones that touch every human being on the planet.
Ok, o que ele mostra dentre vários problemas, ele está destacando a questão do aumento de incidência de pragas e doenças em razão do aumento da temperatura, e ele traz aí a experiência de Vermont, que ele vivenciou toda essa mudança por conta do aumento da temperatura terrestre. I see here that's very, very important when you say increased frequency of weather extremes. So this is something interesting when you talk about weather extremes, storms, floods, and droughts.
Eu Pedro, que o problema é que a temperatura ou essas manifestações de temperatura e de clima é imprevisível. Só falava de Canadá e a Rússia que pensavam que será muito mais caloroso, pero não é assim, é muito mais imprevisível and uneven, which I'm not exactly sure how to say.
Perfect, Susan. Thank you.
All right, thank you both so much. This slide actually violates the principles of good good PowerPoint presentation, but I wanted to point out to you, which I unfortunately can't see for myself, but even at, remember, we are now at 1.2 degrees Celsius. Even at 1.5, the loss of Antarctic sea ice in the summer can be about 50%. And this is what's called a positive feedback loop. I have no idea how to say that in Portuguese, but what happens is that the ice melts. Ice is white, it reflects light. As the ice melts, then the water is dark and actually absorbs more infrared radiation from the sun. So as the problem progresses, it gets worse and worse increasingly quickly.
Ele traz essa problemática do derretimento das geleiras, né, por conta do aumento da temperatura hoje em 1,2, e com isso a problemática dos raios ultravioletas que são absorvidos com uma maior intensidade. Isso tudo em razão ou em decorrência do aumento da temperatura global. Okay.
Important effect is on small island states, such as Mauritius, such as Fiji. And they stand to be inundated altogether. So even at 1.5 degrees, tens of thousands of people can be displaced at the level of warming that we are already experiencing.
Uau, essa problemática tem gerado, inclusive, um impacto em algumas ilhas por conta da inundação que o aumento do nível do mar vai ocorrer e o deslocamento de todas essas pessoas por conta justamente de serem inundadas essas ilhas que são habitadas por pessoas hoje. Yeah, that's a very strong problem.
All right, since we're figuratively, if not literally, in Brazil, there can be a loss of significant biomass, even at 1.5 degrees of warming, and the annual occurrence of heat waves can be significantly increased.
Yeah. E aí ele traz a problemática, especialmente em relação ao Brasil, né, de florestas tropicais, de uma perda de biomassa e com todas as consequências em razão desse aumento climático, da temperatura climática. Okay, Professor David.
Yeah, so whether we are in the Arctic, very far north, or whether we are in the Southern Hemisphere, in the Brazilian Amazon, one can expect, adverse effects. And here's one example. My regional background is in Russia and the former Soviet Union. Temperatures in 2010, so already a decade ago, exceeded 38 degrees Celsius. And I can attest to this personally, in a way that nobody expected. The death rate in Moscow went to 700 per day, entirely unexpectedly due to burning of peat bogs around the Russian capital.
Ele traz realmente a experiência de Moscou, o aumento da temperatura com consequências de mortes, né, um número impressionante por conta desse aumento. Isso ele fala, né, em 2010. Professor David,
yes.
do you mind if you go back in the slide? Because this is something, this permafrost, I think this is a a very specific word, and this is something that the frost is permanent. Is this what this word mean? Permafrost. It's a kind of that's a permanent frost, and then because of the heat, this frost is not there anymore. That's what we can understand about this.
Yes, thank you for the question. So whether we are looking at rainforests in the Brazilian Amazon, permafrost in Siberia, in Russia, or in Canada,
Canada too. Okay.
these are areas that do not thaw out. Where as the name suggests, the ice is permanent, and it turns out that there is a lot of methane, which is a greenhouse gas, a climate disrupting gas that can be and is being released, so that particularly in Siberia, this is an experience that has not happened within anybody's lifetime.
So it means when it melts the ice, the gas go to the atmosphere, and this is the problem. Is this what we can understand about this?
First of all, we're losing the ecosystem of the permafrost. If you think about it, you and I and everybody on this call, everybody on this webinar has evolved over millions of years to live in a particular climate that is more or less stable. Back to my picture about the temperatures, you see that there is some natural variation, but that is more or less stable over time. So this is both a change in climate in magnitude that is unprecedented, but also in speed.
Okay.
And not necessarily reversible.
Oh, really? Oh, this is very strong. Not necessarily reversible.
Yeah, if you remember my introduction was, it's worse than you think. And one of the points of this slide is that regardless of where you are on the planet, if you are in the extreme north, if you are in the tropics, one can expect adverse effects.
So, o problema è di due problemi. Uno é de magnitude e l'altro é de velocidade. Todos os dois que estão manifestando no problema ambiental.
So this is Moscow. One of the effects, as Pedro highlighted in his observation, is on human health, which so far has not been particularly well appreciated. So that this diagram, which comes from the US Centers for Disease Control, now happily back on track. I didn't say that. You can expect changes in mosquitoes, ticks, other carriers of disease. So one can expect an increase in malaria, dengue fever. Zika virus the problems of Zika are exacerbated or are worsened by climate change. Severe weather produces more storms that can have impacts on human beings who are flooded, quite obviously. Heat-related illness, as in Moscow. One can expect forced migration. The term has arisen in international discourse of climate refugees, people who are displaced as those residents of the small island states when their homes are inundated. Where do they go? The international system does not deal very well with this.
Yeah, that's something very, very important when we talk about the climate problem, Professor David. That's something very, very a big problem you are highlighting when you say the forced migration. What to do with all those population that cannot stay anymore because of the changing on the area or the situation of where they were living. So that's also a social problem. That's something that's when you talk about climate change, it's not only the situation of the climate in the region, so it affects the whole globe. That's very strong.
Well, and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees has concluded that climate refugees do not satisfy the ordinary definition of a refugee, which is that one who is fleeing political persecution. I mean, members of my own family have formal refugee status and were fleeing persecution, but the UN High Commissioner has concluded that they do not satisfy the requirements for protection under the 1951 Refugee Convention.
They don't get the protection from the state because of this situation. Is this?
The intergovernmental, não tem a proteção de la Nações Unidas.
Okay.
Not just the state, but the organização intergovernmental.
Perfeito. Okay.
And then the last in this group, and again, this comes from the World Meteorological Organization, which is a specialized agency of the UN. So this is not coming from an advocacy organization. This is not coming from groups that have an interest in overstating the problem. This is a neutral, science-driven conclusion. 821 million undernourished people as a result of climate change in 2017, increased tropical cyclone activity. One important point is that corals are being lost through two effects. One is the increase in ocean temperature, and the other is the increasing acidity of the oceans as the oceans absorb carbon dioxide from the air.
Just to understand this, when you talk, because of those, the corals, they are dying, and then the ocean is absorbing the gas and then causing the problem. And what is this? Can you explain a little bit more about this? The blue carbon is. Can you explain a little bit more about this, Professor David?
Certainly. In fact, I did not plant this question. I was originally trained as a chemist and spent an entire semester titrating the Indian Ocean,
Wow.
Pacific Ocean. I thought it was totally useless and incredibly boring. It now turns out to be quite important from a policy point of view and of very great interest to everyone on the planet. As carbon is absorbed from the atmosphere, it makes water more acidic. You can see this if you have sparkling or carbonated water in your refrigerator at this moment. It has an acidic taste to it, tastes more like lemons than ordinary water does. That's because carbon, if you're drinking Perrier or whatever your favorite carbonated water is, the reason that it has that slightly acidic taste is because carbon dioxide has been added and it is absorbed by the water. You can see that when you open the bottle and the bubbles come out. So that's one effect. Corals, of course, are their entire skeleton is made of carbonate, is made of
calcium, like calcium.
Right, absolutely. And corals obviously cannot move very quickly. If the water temperature increases off the coast of Australia, they can't very well move to the coast of Japan or something like that. It takes generations for those coral reefs to form. So they are suffering both from the increase in water temperature, as we were discussing before, as well as the absorption of excess carbon from the atmosphere. When I wrote that article in 1989, it was thought that, wow, the oceans can absorb lots of carbon, and that's reassuring to us. Well, it's actually not reassuring, because excess carbon dioxide in the water has adverse effects on aquatic ecosystems as well.
Uma coisa antes, Pedro, que você fala a transmissão, é que é que professor Wirth era químico antes de ser um professor de direito. Ele fez pesquisa sobre a qualidade de água salgada e água doce. Só antes de ser professor de direito ambiental.
This is amazing.
Yeah.
So, so this is the end of the first part of my presentation. What I am trying to convince you of is that the problem is probably worse than you realized when you signed on to this webinar. So what the world is doing about it. And the answer is largely the Paris Agreement, which was adopted in 2015. The precursor to the Paris Agreement, which you may have heard of, is called the Kyoto Protocol. All of these agreements are named after the cities in which they were adopted. Hence, it helps to keep them straight in your head. So originally, the United Nations identified in 1992 33 states and international organizations, which include the United States, Canada, OECD countries, the Russian Federation, but do not include Brazil, China, India. One of the reasons was that the thinking was that those states had contributed relatively little to the problem. Most of the carbon in the atmosphere, if you could put flag on it, it would have the stars and stripes of the United States. The United States historically is the world's largest emitter.
Ok. Então, depois de destacar a questão problemática, né, que a gente realmente concorda com ele que ela é muito mais grave do que poderia parecer, aí ele passa a falar do Tratado de Paris e do antecessor Tratado de Kyoto. Ele chama atenção, os nomes foram aonde foram assinados esses documentos internacionais e não há, nesse momento, a participação de países como o Brasil, China, que não participam desse primeiro momento, porque não foram os que deram causa, né, naquele momento de assinatura a essa problemática climática. E ele chama atenção para os Estados Unidos como sendo um país onde, de fato, há uma problemática muito forte decorrente com a própria economia de desenvolvimento dos Estados Unidos. Susan.
Nothing to add there.
Okay.
So the Kyoto Protocol, in fact, was a tremendous success. It did not include any commitments other than from those 33 states. The United States, in fact, contributed a great deal. This was under the Clinton administration to the structure of the agreement, but the United States never became a party because it was opposed in the US Senate, which is necessary for its advice and consent to ratification.
Ele chama atenção para todo o esforço norte-americano de aderir ao protocolo, mas ele não se implementa por uma não aprovação do Senado norte-americano, que é uma etapa do processo de ratificação do Tratado Internacional.
Okay, so, to 2015, the goal of the Paris Agreement was to bring in the entire world. So not just those 33 states, but all 193 states on the planet. So that was one innovation from Paris. The world's largest emitter is no longer the United States. The world's largest national emitter is China. So it has become apparent in the meantime that it is essential to bring in all states on terms that they can agree to.
Ok, o Tratado de Paris, diferente do documento anterior, ele engloba os 193 estados, países, e não apenas 33, e agora passa a incluir China como... you said China is the one that the highest level is from China nowadays, is this what you said?
So what the Paris Agreement does is to commit to hold warming below 2 degrees Celsius with an additional goal to, sorry, Zoom doesn't like PowerPoint under some circumstances, and also pursue more aggressive efforts to hold the temperature increase to 1.5. Meantime, since 2015, particularly at the initiative of small island states, particularly Fiji, the world has now focused on this 1.5 degree goal. And remember, we're already at 1.2 because of the very severe effects that can occur even as low as 1.5 degrees Celsius, if you think back to the slides before about the permafrost in the Brazilian Amazon.
E aí você coloca essa meta de 1.5 já é 1.2, e isso já é realmente um grande problema para se enfrentar. Ok, Professor David.
Okay, the other two pillars of the climate regime, which I'll be glad to answer questions about, but in the interest of time, it's difficult to focus on. One is to, the reduction in emissions is called mitigation in English. Also, the second piece is adaptation. So for instance, in my home city and Susan's home city of Boston, we are now dealing with the effects of sea level rise in downtown Boston, where there is flooding on the waterfront. We have to deal with that because we know that it is going to happen, whether or not we make further emissions reduction. And then the third piece is finance, particularly for those states that were not among the 33 large industrialized developed states, OECD states, but among states including Brazil, India, China, as well as those small island states.
Essa preocupação de colocar os limites, colocar a meta da temperatura máxima, os modelos de enfrentamento das consequências, e aí ele traz já o exemplo de Boston, onde se sabe que vai haver o avanço da água em Boston mesmo, é uma realidade não só de Boston, mas mundial, e a questão financeira, para que esses maiores países industrializados eles possam contribuir também globalmente com a redução desse aumento, mundialmente falando.
Okay, so how does the Paris Agreement go about doing that? There was a very strong reaction to the very highly structured nature of the Kyoto Protocol, so that the core of the Paris Agreement is now the nationally determined contribution. And note, by the way, that it is not a commitment. It is a contribution, it is non-binding. And the idea is that states will voluntarily contribute these every 5 years. So if you're interested, you can see them all at this website.
Ele chama a atenção que o ponto central do Acordo de Paris é o que ele chamou dessa contribuição nacional, que ela não é um compromisso obrigatório, mas uma contribuição para que os países possam, de 5 em 5 anos, contribuir com a política global.
So this is something that you can research yourself, but I've collected some of them for you so that you can see. The European Union commits to reducing its emissions by 40% by the year 2030 compared to 1990. This is the way most international environmental agreements are structured. They have a base year, they have a target year, and they have a percentage reduction in the meantime. So the European Union has made a contribution. Get these out and then you can comment on them. The United States in 2015, remember this was under Obama, committed by contrast to a 26 to 28% reduction, compare that to 40, compared to 2005, as opposed to 1990, and only by 2025. The reason for this is that the United States, and I can say this from personal experience, typically negotiates international agreements in a way that it promises to do only what it can already do domestically. If you think about it, that's not going to work on climate, as we're going to see a little bit later on when I talk about the new US NDC. So this is relatively modest based on basically reductions that are available in federal law.
Ele traz, então, o exemplo das promessas de redução de contribuição, a União Europeia em 40%, e uma previsão mais tímida dos Estados Unidos menor. Mas a perspectiva é que os Estados Unidos se compromete dentro do que ele consegue reduzir internamente, domesticamente. E por isso se observa aqui um número menor. Ok.
I originally gave this presentation 2 days before the Paris Agreement entered into force and 6 days before Donald Trump was elected in Moscow. And when I made this presentation, I included the Russian language, and the Russian audience always bursts out laughing because of this might be in here, which as in English has 2 meanings. It could possibly be, or we don't know. It's uncertain. So the Russian Federation has also been very skeptical about making reductions to limit climate change.
Professor Wirth, could you repeat for us the NDC, what that acronym stands for?
It stands for Nationally Determined Contribution.
Got it.
And most definitely not a commitment. So nationally determined offering, proposal. And you can see that in the Russian language, right? There's nothing to prevent any state from saying, well, we'll sort of give it a try. We'll identify something we might aim for, but no promises. So,
excuse me, Professor David. So if it's is an NDC, nationally determined contribution, is just a suggestion. So they can say 70%, and that might be, but it may not occur. So how can we cannot force this? How can we have to be more effective when they do those proposals? Because if they don't reach this, what's going to happen? Nothing.
Well, excellent observation. First of all, there's no real enforcement mechanism in the Paris Agreement, number one. And number two, these contributions, as suggested by the word, are all voluntary. And if you just look at these 3, they don't necessarily, they're not coordinated.
No.
So
I want to ask Professor Wirth a question. Isn't it still worth it, even if it's not enforceable and even if it's voluntary?
The answer is yes, because this is all we've got. And the theory of the Paris Agreement, somewhat counterintuitively, is that instead of trying to force states to make reductions, it's better to ask them what they are inclined to do voluntarily. The Kyoto Agreement took a long time to enter into force and had a relatively modest success. But the theory here is that you can't force to make reductions in emissions, and so better to coordinate them in this loose way. So if you take all the NDCs that were proposed in 2015 and add them up, it still gets you only to about 3 degrees. Remember, the goal is 2 degrees in the agreement. You add up all these voluntary contributions, and they still limit warming only by 3 degrees.
A short translation. A minha pergunta foi justamente dentro dessa ideia dessas contribuições, já que são não compromissórias, ou seja, não há como se obrigar o Estado a realizar aquela redução. E esse foi justamente o meu questionamento. Você vê uma disparidade de propostas, 40%, 26%, 70%, 75%, e isso realmente eu questionei, mas qual é a efetividade dessa proposta, né? Já que é uma mera proposta. E o professor traz como sendo, não há como se forçar e talvez deixar para que cada país, dentro de uma realidade local e de uma vontade, possa então cumprir o seu objetivo, isso talvez tenha uma maior eficiência. Mas o meu questionamento foi justamente nisso: como se forçar, né, a essa redução, qual é a efetividade? Mas dentro do protocolo de Paris não há essa previsão de se obrigar. But can we say, Professor David, that if we see a state that is part of the Paris Agreement that has the level very high and is not contributing, can we say that the other countries, they can, I don't know, stop sending manufacturer products to this country in a way of trying to force to reduce, or there is no way to think about uh, any enforcement of the reduction that we see? Because if we let them, okay, we want to push forward the economy, so we're going to produce, and there is no consequence about this.
Well, this is what the enforcement mechanism, such as it is or is not, is generally referred to as the mobilization of shame. If you tune into the BBC, the British refer to this as naming and shaming. So there is a sense that some states are contributing to solving the problem and others are left behind and are not doing their share. So for instance, of the states on the previous slide, the general sense is that the EU is a leader. The United States has been entirely unpredictable through the Trump administration, and I'll get to the new administration in just a second. And Russia is a state that is dependent upon oil and gas. So for instance, when I gave this presentation at my alma mater, what was then Leningrad State University is now St. Petersburg State University. My host said, afterwards, he said, well, I thought we really could work with you, except that you have to understand that we do a lot of consulting for oil and gas companies, so I think not. I don't know how to translate that.
Yeah.
You want to do it, Pedro?
Yeah. Eu questionei justamente se haveria algum mecanismo internacional dos países não fornecerem mais, como o caso da Rússia, que depende de óleo e gás, e como talvez um mecanismo de redução, mas ao que parece, isso tem sido, cada país tem a sua, talvez, consciência nessa problemática que é mundial, e não há como se fazer esse mecanismo de se forçar essa redução. E acaba ficando muito imprevisível, né? Ele coloca dentro da ideia de imprevisibilidade. Susan, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I would just say, but I'm just thinking about os professores russos não podem trabalhar com o professor Wirth porque eles se apoiam sobre o petróleo demasiado, e o professor Wirth está falando do limitação no desenvolvimento do petróleo e de recursos naturais.
Okay.
All right. Let's look at two others, and then we'll, in the interest of time, I will move to current events. This one is China. And remember, China did not have any obligations under the old Kyoto Protocol. The other states, the EU, the US did. So what China has agreed to is to achieve the peaking of carbon dioxide emissions around 2030. And this is classic diplomacy, right? To achieve, well, maybe yes, maybe no, around But this was thought to be a very significant breakthrough, because if you think about it, in order to bring down emissions of carbon, you have to hit a peak and then start on a downward trajectory. Let me just do the rest of this one and then pause. So this is very important from the point of view of the world, China being the largest emitter. Second of all, to lower carbon dioxide emissions per unit of GDP. This is what's called an intensity commitment. It's not an absolute number. It is to bring down the amount of carbon emitted per unit of production, because carbon emissions are associated with the burning of fossil fuels, coal, natural gas, and petroleum. To increase the share of non-fossil fuels, that is renewable resources, to 20% of the economy, and then to increase the forest stock. This is important for China, but also particularly for countries such as Indonesia and Brazil that have large standing forests.
Just to understand, Professor David, what do we, when we talk about China, so they are allowing that they develop until they get the peak of the emission because of they are producing and the economy is developing, and then after this they are going to go down. Is this or what I understood?
Yes, the agreement itself, the Paris Agreement, says to achieve the peaking of carbon dioxide emissions as soon as possible. So this is in fact a more serious commitment than contained in the agreement as a whole. On the other hand, we know now that 1.5 degrees is going to have significant adverse effects, and we have a very short time until 2030, in fact, to make reductions of something like 40% globally in order to stave off the worst effects. So this is already thinking that is to a considerable extent out of date.
Okay.
I just wanted to show you as well, since given the audience, Brazil. Brazil offered to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by an absolute amount, unlike China, by 37% by 2025. And second of all, to reduce emissions by 43% by 2030, which is for a non-OECD state is in fact a big commitment.
Então, ele traz os valores propostos pelo Brasil de redução dos gases que causam o efeito estufa, valores significativos, e, portanto, ele chama atenção para o número significativo desses valores de redução propostos pelo Brasil. Ok.
In the interest of time, I'm going to skip some slides and bring you right up to date to April of 2021. Sorry about this. The sponsors have the PowerPoint. I'll be glad to share it with you. This is breaking news. The United States now has made its second NDC, its second contribution. So its first goal was 17% below 2005. The Obama was, if you remember, 26 to 28%. And the Biden administration has now promised, gosh, I don't remember the number now, I can't read it on the slide, but it's in the neighborhood of, I think, 40+% by 2030.
And this was yesterday, David, or today?
No, this is April, and then I'll bring you up to today. So this is a major contribution. Unlike the previous ones, it's primarily sector by sector. electricity, transport, buildings, etc. And most importantly, it is something that the United States cannot now promise that it is going to achieve. A lot of this depends upon legislation that is currently pending in the US Congress. And the United States, being a federal state like Brazil, has some difficulty, I'm commenting only on the US, not Brazil, but has some difficulty in working with subnational units, such as my own state of Massachusetts, which tends to be a good one. But this is going to require a whole of society, not just whole of government, but a whole of society commitment to meet these reductions that are in the interest of the entire world. One thing you have to remember is that a molecule of carbon emitted in the United States has the same effect in Brazil as it has in China, as it has in South Africa, and vice versa. So this is in everybody's interest, and also, and I would say this is a good thing, as an international lawyer, contrary to my foreign ministry training, that the United States is prepared to take on a goal and then figure out how to do it after the fact. Very uncharacteristic of the US.
So, para clarificar, Pedro,
Yes.
não é tão, oh my God, característico. Não é tão característico por os Estados Unidos a fazer uma meta que não é, neste momento, absolutamente possível. Normalmente, nós obligamos só sobre coisas que sabemos que podemos fazer, mas isso necessita a cooperação de toda a sociedade, toda a gente, todo o pessoal, as companhias, empresas, estados, e não só a nível federal, mas a nível estadual também.
Just to be clear, Professor David, so and thank you, Susan, for the good translation in Portuguese. When you say those new contribution of the United States, it depends on the approval of the parliament. Is this what you said? So it doesn't. That's only that isn't only a question of the decision of the executive. We still need the approval of the parliament. And the question is, if if the states if they can pass the contributions that are stronger and they can reduce more than the national general level. E então, traduzindo, a minha pergunta é se essa proposta de redução que ele traz agora de abril de 2021, se ela depende do Congresso norte-americano e se os estados podem estabelecer uma meta de redução maior ainda para aquele estado. Professor David.
Yes, so achieving this contribution, I'm looking at the original now, 50%, 50 to 52%, I don't know if you can see it. That's an extraordinarily large contribution in a short period of time. If the US can meet this goal, it will substantially reduce the warming that occurs after 2030. And we have relatively little time. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is telling us that we must make reductions of on the order of 40% globally by 2030 in order to stave off the worst effects of climate change. Of course, the US is a very large economy.
Okay, and just to confirm, so we still need the approval of the Congress, and if the states they can pass stronger contribution.
Right. So so for instance, in Massachusetts, we have our own Global Warming Solutions Act with targets like this. And in fact, the prior administration, a Democratic administration, as well as the current Republican administration, said, oh, well, those are just nice ideas. So I worked with a group, the Conservation Law Foundation. We sued the governor of Massachusetts and we won. The Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts held that those are binding targets and that the state of Massachusetts must meet them. This is obligatory. Regardless of what the Paris Agreement says, regardless of what the federal government says, we here in Massachusetts are obliged legally to contribute to making those reductions. That includes not just the government, but also individuals, and I'll get to that in just a second. So this is going to require a whole of society, not just whole of government, not just federal government, not just the states, not even municipalities, but also individuals to contribute towards reaching this goal. So for instance, the town that I live in adopted an ordinance that prohibits the building of new homes, of new infrastructure that rely on natural gas for heating or for cooking. In fact, the Attorney General of Massachusetts overruled that and said that that was illegal under the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. But it shows you that these kinds of efforts are required at all levels, down to and including the individual.
David, could you give us, when you have a chance, if you could give me the name of the Supreme Judicial Court case so that we can better understand what was the hook that created the obligation on the part of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts vis-a-vis the law? What was that hook?
It's called the Global Warming Solutions Act. And the case is Kane, K-A-I-N, the Department of Environmental Conservation. This is part of an effort nationwide in the United States initiated by children, teenagers. They're the ones who are going to suffer from this. Our children and their children and future generations, to enforce the law. And in fact, they did successfully, but it's a big effort throughout the entire country.
Sensacional, Susan. This is incredible. No estado de Massachusetts, se tem uma decisão que a Susan colocou no chat, o precedente que ela chama atenção, pelo qual a Suprema Corte do Estado de Massachusetts e nos Estados Unidos as decisões estaduais elas têm uma força diferente do Brasil, porque acabam sendo definitivas e vinculativas e vinculantes. Então, nesse precedente se estabeleceu que não é apenas uma meta, mas sim uma obrigação, e se tem como forçar que as empresas, os indivíduos cumpram e atinjam esse limite que foi estabelecido para o estado de Massachusetts. Então, ele coloca como sendo, inclusive, uma obrigação não apenas do Estado, mas também da sociedade, das indústrias, das casas. As casas novas, por exemplo, não podem ter aquecimento com gás natural, mas isso são limites que são colocados com o objetivo de se atingir essa proposta que foi passada aí para o estado de Massachusetts. Professor David, do you think we can, this good example of the decision of the precedent in the Massachusetts state, do you think we can also have like a general standard for the country that we can say this is enforcement too, or it depends on each state to have the decision of have it enforced or not?
Well, the theory under the Paris Agreement is that states, 193 of them, Brazil, the United States, China, South Africa, make contributions, and then it is up to each of those states, Brazil, the United States, South Africa, etc., to figure out how to meet that within their own social structure and within their own constitutional structures.
Okay.
So that's the way most international agreements work. The criticism of the prior instrument, the Kyoto Protocol, was that it was too top-down. It was too much focused on governments, and we just don't have that kind of time.
I also just added into the Bato Papo, one of our alumni from the master's program at Boston College, Claudio Ferreira has contributed to a book by the OAB called La Coletânea de Artigos sobre los 40 años de Política Nacional do Meio Ambiente. So I thought you might want to take a look at that from the Brazilian perspective, from one of our own alumni.
Thank you, Susan. Professor Claudio, thank you so much for sharing with us this book about Brazil.
All right, if you have been following the news, the group of 7 industrialized countries just concluded its meeting in England, in Great Britain. So this is a strategy that is oftentimes utilized within the international system. The G7 are large industrialized wealthy countries with market economies. If they can reach agreement among themselves, then that can build outwards to other states as well. So there's another group called the G20, which meets occasionally, and they are building outwards to the entirety of the United Nations, consisting of 193 states. So 7 states concluded their meeting just yesterday. This is really hot news.
Yes.
So they pledged to keep the 1.5 degree goal within reach. That's important because remember the Paris Agreement said, well, 2 degrees and maybe we'll try for 1.5. Now you have the 7 largest industrialized economies saying, no, we're going to aim for that 1.5. Achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible and by 2050 at the latest. In other words, among those 7 states, if they keep their commitments to each other, there will still be some emissions, but they will be offset. And we'll talk about that briefly in just a minute. So these are major commitments, including targeting coal in particular, which is per unit of energy produced, is the most polluting. So for instance, natural gas only contributes maybe 57% as much as the same amount of coal in terms of emissions. Coal is identified as I hesitate to say it, but a bad actor. And importantly, let me see. Oops, so far I've been doing okay with it.
Estamos clarificando também que o grupo de 7 são Canadá, França, Germânia, Itália, Japão, o Reino Unido e os Estados Unidos, 46% do GDP global.
Wow.
And they committed to mobilize 100 billion per year. Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, promised this in 2009. The United States had promised 3 billion. When Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement, the Obama administration had already contributed 1 billion and the other 2 never materialized. This is $100 billion from the G7, the 7 richest countries, for the world, including reduction of mitigation means reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The World Bank is also on board. Remember, these are the largest donors to the World Bank. MDB stands for Multilateral Development Banks. And particularly from the point of Brazil, the G7 acknowledged their contribution to the decline of biodiversity in places such as the Brazilian Amazon and pledged to pay our part in its restoration and to conserve at least 30% of their own land, as well as to contribute to that goal globally. So if these goals can be achieved, we would be well on our way to saving the climate.
Ok, o professor David traz uma notícia que ele chama de notícia extremamente atual, quente, de ontem. Essa comunicação do grupo G7, que a Susan já colocou, uma das maiores potências econômicas e industriais do mundo, com essa proposta de redução, a manutenção do 1,5 de aquecimento, a redução, zerar a emissão de gases que causam o efeito estufa e, portanto, se for atingido isso que se propõe, ele vê esperança em se salvar, né? O planeta, vamos colocar de modo bem geral, genérico assim. Susan, do you want to add something?
No, only that we have a question from Antonio Andre Rosado. And what about China in all of this?
Well, China is not a member of the G7, but the idea is, first of all, it was a bilateral agreement between the United States and China that basically made the Paris Agreement go. If you think about it, these are the world's two largest economies, both of them dependent on fossil fuels. So this is the same strategy, a bilateral agreement, two states, the United States and China, and then build out. Here you have the G7 taking the same approach. And they say that they're willing to put $100 billion per year into the effort of helping other countries to achieve this goal. So China is not formally part of this, but you can be sure that the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs is paying close attention to what's happening in Britain and this communique.
Muito interessante, because David, China was mentioned in the communique for other reasons as well. So there were a lot of things China was paying attention to yesterday.
I just wanted to briefly now we're talking at the global level. We're talking about heads of state, including the Queen of England herself came to the meeting. Now to get back to the individual and the very local level. Just three issues that are important in everybody's daily life. The first is, where does your electricity come from? The second is, what kind of car, what kind of vehicles, what sort of transport do you use? And third, what can we do in our daily lives to offset, in the sense of reduce emissions from activities such as plane flights, which is a very large sector. So I actually took this from my own town, which has an option. If you walk around my town, you will see signs that have this 100% green. So that when I get my electric bill, I can opt into the basic, the name of the town is Brookline. I can opt into the basic, which, by the way, already includes renewables, or 30%, or 65%, or 100%. If you're talking about the mobilization of shame and the notion of community solidarity, when I walk around my town and I see those green signs that say 100%, I say, oh, well, my neighbors are pitching in, they're doing their part, shouldn't I do mine?
Sim, sim.
So,
E não só isso, Pedro, pero eu como estudante, quando eu era estudante, a tomar 30% ou 65%, it's like failing, right? That's a failing grade. You feel that. It's 100, it's an A+ or bust.
Yeah, right. I look at it that way, but and people put these signs up outside their houses.
I love it.
Okay, another.
Just to do this translation, Professor David, that's very interesting. This is the experience of Brookline. That is a town in Massachusetts. Just to explain to Brazil. Ele traz o exemplo da cidade que ele mora, que é Brookline, que é uma das cidades mais de maior qualidade de vida que você poderia colocar na região de Boston, que é Brookline. E há esse movimento da cidade de os vizinhos, né, colocarem as placas de que eles estão aderindo 100% à energia limpa. Isso ele sente que é uma questão, se o meu vizinho está, eu preciso também agir assim. Então, é uma questão de senso de comunidade, de estar estimulando para que o outro também possa contribuir como sociedade, como exercendo o seu papel dentro de uma comunidade. Então, ele sente realmente que e me parece ser uma questão cultural, sem dúvida, que isso estimula para que os outros também façam e entrem nesse movimento de cada um contribuir com um pouco, fazer a sua parte. Ok, David.
Yes, so if just to add, if in terms of the social dynamic, if the goal is 1,000 for 100%, and we have 999 are for 100%, and I'm not, and I'm keeping the town from reaching that goal, well, am I doing my part? So just
this is Professor, this is a sense of community that you are explaining. And we are talking about, I was trying to explain Brookline, that's a very healthy city in Massachusetts. But do you think this feeling that you were sharing, and I agree, is this something we can expect from other cities that they have in the ranking like a C-, I don't know, a letter D? We're talking about an A+ city. Do you think we also have this sense of community in other areas, or that's a question of, it depends on which city we are talking about?
Right. Well, I think that this kind of sensibility is universal. So for instance, just to give you an example, and I hope nobody takes offense at this, when I've been doing this a long time, I made a diplomatic tour through Europe in 1985 or so on a different issue. And I stopped in Paris. The big environmental policy issue at the time was contaminants in these aperitifs, like Dubonnet and that sort of thing. And it struck me as, whoa, there's a lot more going on than Dubonnet. And now if you go to Paris, recycling is mandatory. This is true. I've spent a fair amount of time in Italy. Recycling is very strictly mandatory. So this is a sensibility that can be deployed certainly in other places on the planet. I wouldn't want to speak for cultures that I'm less familiar with, but I think it's a common human sense that to want to buy into a collective action. I mean, if you think about COVID, all of a sudden the world was hit, and this touched every human being on the planet and required action by everybody to wear a mask, get a vaccine, whatever. Some people said, no, I don't choose to participate, but there certainly is a tremendous sense of social pressure to participate in this war on the vaccine. Climate I'm putting my advocate's hat on right now. Climate is just as much a war. It is affecting just as many people. In other words, everybody on the planet. The difference is that it's not something that happens all at once, that there's a lockdown, there's a shutdown, and everybody is instantly aware that there's a serious problem facing our planet. The difference with this one is that it's coming on more slowly, and the world is coming around to an appreciation of the collective nature of the response that's required.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
All right.
A quick translation. O meu questionamento é se realmente isso é esse senso de comunidade é uma realidade de acordo com o desenvolvimento de uma cidade, de uma região, e ele coloca como sendo uma realidade, um senso comum, e traz a experiência da Covid como um reforço para essa ideia de senso comum, de um comportamento de que todos devem contribuir para que atinjam o objetivo comum. Há uma diferença entre a Covid e a situação climática. As duas são duas guerras que o globo está envolvido, só que a diferença é que na Covid o impacto direto para cada cidadão ele é imediato, é um lockdown, é uma medida restritiva, enquanto que na guerra climática, que é no mesmo nível, ele coloca, A diferença é que não há um impacto tão imediato, mas ele afirma que isso passa a ser um senso de comunidade, né, que começa, que ele entende ser global, né, na visão dele.
And
Ok,
then
professor?
Pedro, I just wanted to say that answers a question from one of our participants who asked about the connection between lessons learned from the pandemic and that of climate change. So
Two other brief examples. One is electric vehicles. I have to say I was something of a skeptic about vehicles. Certainly they do not produce pollution coming out of the tailpipe. But if you think about it, the electricity has to come from somewhere.
Yes.
If it's coming from a coal-fired power plant, maybe it's just as bad. So this is a report from the Union of Concerned Scientists that shows, as you might expect, that the upfront environmental costs of a battery-powered vehicle are higher than for a gasoline-powered vehicle. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if you look at how they average over their lives, gasoline produces 381 grams of carbon dioxide per mile. A hybrid produces 191. This is mixed electric and gasoline, whereas a full battery electric is only 123.
Wow.
This is the important point, is that over the lifetime of the vehicle, the costs of mining the lithium and creating the battery, yes, there may be some environmental costs there, but so long as you keep your car long enough, you will eventually be contributing to the solution rather than the problem.
Wow, thank you, Professor Wirth. This is a debate I've been having with some family members for some time now.
The important piece is the life cycle analysis. What is the environmental impact of the vehicle over its entire life?
So, qual è l'impatto del veicolo durante la vita dell'usanza del veicolo? Se uno compra un veicolo cada anno, un nuovo veicolo, un carro ogni 2 anos ou 3 anos, não basta fazer um impacto, però se tem um veículo há 7, 10 anos, começa a fazer um impacto sobre o ambiente no modo positivo. Would you say 7 to 8 to 10, something around that range, David?
I would hesitate to speculate, but there definitely is a turning point at which the car begins to become environmentally preferable, as opposed to if you buy a new electric vehicle every year, maybe you're contributing to the problem.
I also want to mention, I drove at one point a Prius, and it actually improved its fuel efficiency after 5 years. It actually, so durante la vida del meu Prius, começou a aumentar o número de milhas, de quilômetros que eu posso utilizar durante a vida do veículo depois de 5 anos, na minha experiência. Solo é qualitativa, não quantitativa. Just a qualitative observation, not a quantitative one.
Right, just one point about the impediments, and this is identified in the G7 communique. For instance, I live in an apartment building. It's a condominium. It's governed by a board of directors that is not particularly environmentally aware. So I could not purchase an electric vehicle because I cannot charge it in the garage in my apartment building. So this is an impediment that needs to be overcome. Mm-hmm. And you're taping this, but I'm still prepared to say this. I might get fired for it. Susan, if you remember, the parking lot outside the law school was redone a number of years ago. Mm-hmm. Before the parking lot was redone, the number of electric vehicle charging stations was 0. After it was redone, the number of electric vehicle charging stations was 0.
I knew that's what you were going to say, and I'm very sorry to hear it.
But it shows and I actually asked about this, but it shows the need for awareness.
Conocencia.
Where I live and where I drive my car, I could not purchase this 120.
Sim, sim, que ele coloca, David coloca que se ele compra um veículo elétrico, pero aonde demora, se não tem a possibilidade de recarregar a bateria, ou se vai ao seu trabalho, o trabalho não tem a possibilidade de recarregar a bateria, tem um problema. You need to have a place to recharge along your route. It's almost like an island of safety. Otherwise, nobody wants to be in a vehicle that will suddenly stop in the middle of the road. Right, Pedro?
Sim, sim. Então, Susan traz esse elemento também no complemento da tradução. Por mais que o professor David queira comprar um carro elétrico, no lugar onde ele mora, que é um condomínio de apartamentos, não tem como ele carregar na garagem dele, nem mesmo no trabalho. Então, esse é um outro problema que surge. Por mais que, do ponto de vista de contribuição social, ele queira ter um carro elétrico, isso depende de outros estímulos, né?
Can I also add to that, Pedro, how much we take for granted? Because I should have just as much of a risk driving a conventional vehicle, but I don't. I don't even think twice about it. I know there's going to be a gas station somewhere, and I don't even think twice about it. And that's where the crime lies, okay? If you want to call it a lack of a moral code, is that we simply assume the resource will be there for us. And so go ahead and why don't you translate that rather than...
Yes, but the question is Professor David, this is the problem. You want to have an electric car, and where you live, you cannot charge it. But how can we force it? How can we force the where we work for them to have the electric station there? What is the solution? That's a movement that each person must do to try to mobilize and push forward this movement. How?
Yes.
Well, one other point of view, and this is a view that has taken hold in the United States over the past 40 years or so. People tend to view government as the other, as something that's bossing them around, telling them that they have to do things that they don't want to do, such as to wear masks. The government is, in fact, the alter ego of the people and acting on our collective behalf. So if the legislature of Massachusetts were to adopt a law requiring my condominium board to put in electric vehicle charging stations in the garage, whether they like it or not, and to issue a directive to Boston College that when it redoes its parking lot, it must put in some electric vehicle charging stations. This is something that requires, no matter how hard I try as an individual, I'm probably not going to overcome these impediments. And so then we have to look at the government as our alter ego. Now that's my personal view, and I should identify it as such, but let me just give one more example.
Okay.
Civil aviation, and then I'll finish. You've all been very patient. One very large source of emissions is civil aviation. So that is commercial airline flights. So for instance, Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish environmental activist, when she came from from Europe to New York for the climate summit, she came in a sailboat, so zero emissions there. On the other hand, certain well-known environmentalists, including a former vice president of the United States, routinely take commercial airplanes to these meetings. That is creating emissions. And so the question is, what do we do about that? And the answer that has been given is to require some sort of offsets. Some of you may have experienced when you buy an airplane ticket, you can actually purchase offsets voluntarily, so that a tree will be, if I take a flight from Boston, I can ask to have a tree planted in Paraguay or in Brazil and pay for that voluntarily. So the notion is that this is a very polluting industry by its very nature, and how do we mitigate or reduce the effects of it? The answer that's been given by the UN International Civil Aviation Organization, so a specialized agency of the UN, is a new scheme requiring carbon offsetting. In fact, before we started, Pedro was saying, what's this word offset? How do I translate it into Portuguese? I mean, you're doing a much better job than I ever could do in Portuguese or Russian or anything else.
Thank you.
This is a number, this is the offset is an action that's taken to absorb carbon from the atmosphere, say by planting trees.
É um tipo de recalibração para reentrar no equilíbrio, para pagar o custo real do voo, right? So this is a recalibration to pay the real cost of your trip and not just the airline ticket price.
Right, and not just so, and this is now agreed internationally, actually as a result of the inaction by the EU that the US objected to. But so it is now going to be mandatory from 2030. So at the international level, if you think about it, international civil aviation, international airplane flights require collective action at literally the global level. So just before you get too excited about this, ICAO, the UN specialized agency, requires purchase of offsets through one of 6 schemes. And the one that jumped out at me, so we don't end on too happy a note, is which is actually set up by the old Kyoto Protocol and involves exactly what we're talking about, which was schemes undertaken by, states that have obligations in states that do not. The CPM experienced a very severe scandal. It turned out that almost all the projects were being done in China. And among people who work in the field, CDM became known as the Chinese Development Mechanism. Most of them were being done in the industrial sector, and it was demonstrable that some of them did not involve any additionality. In other words, they were projects that would have been undertaken anyway without the international support. So the learning here is that one needs to be very careful about the integrity of all of these and to make sure that whatever offsetting mechanisms are identified are in fact taking place, and they are in fact real reductions that otherwise would not occur. Just to give you, so Delta, I'll probably get sued for this. The Delta in July of 2019 put out a press release, biofuels and carbon offsets power Delta's first carbon neutral flights. Well, then when you start to dig beneath the surface, there was in the industry press a follow-up report right before the pandemic that Delta's carbon neutrality, but there's less to it than meets the eye. In other words, these offsets were not necessarily really taking place. And also, to end on a less than cheery note, if you think about it, international aviation has gone way down during the pandemic. So it turns out that no airline will need to purchase offsets for 6 years from now, even during the voluntary period under ICAO, because of the reduction, because of the flights that haven't taken place during the pandemic. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much. And thank you for being so patient and tolerant. I hope that this has added something to your understanding of the current reality of the climate problem.
Well, David, I think l'unica cosa che eu quero agregar que caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, make sure that you know that your commitments are being honored by the people who claim to be honoring them. And David, I don't think you can get sued for telling the truth. So that is a perfect defense. So eu estou falando só que professor David coloca a verdade, que não posso entrar no litígio para dizendo a verdade, não? Pedro, what do you think? How are you feeling? How does this make you feel?
Susan, I this is something that I feel that we as part of the community, we have a very strong responsibility and power. And uh, that was something very interesting when I saw in the chat. I don't know who was saying something about this. Okay, let's talk about electric cars, but it was Antonio André Rosado.
Sí.
There is a very strong oil industry and company that's not so easy. Okay, everybody wants to move to electric cars. There is a lot of other industries or economies, and so uh, that's why I think that the role of each person as part of the community can force these changes, can push forward those changes. So my conclusion is, I know that there is the importance of the countries 193 to do their part, but we as human beings and part of this community, this global community, and it was very important the relation Professor David did with COVID. We are in a war like COVID is, but that's a different war because the effects are not so close. But we must do our part, and this is something that is very strong for me to develop the sense of community, or the sense of trying to do something and trying to do your part. This is very strong for me.
Professor Wirth, I have a question for you. We answered many of you answered. Você respondeu muitas perguntas que temos no bate-papo. Já perguntado, já respondido. Pero uma coisa que resta é uma pergunta de um dos participantes sobre the opposite of what Pedro just said, actually. A question that was asked that was kind of the opposite. We all have a part to play, but there was an impulse I saw in the chat. And it goes something maybe closer to where the Kyoto Protocol may have gone, which is, what about at the international level? I hate to ask this question, but it has been asked. Is there ever going to be an international environmental court, or what is the closest thing to it?
Well, first of all, there is no court of general jurisdiction in the international system. So for instance, if I, in that same parking lot, were to, as I'm pulling out of the parking lot, were to hit Susan's car, she can sue me in the courts of Massachusetts.
Right.
There's no international court like that. So all international courts exercise jurisdiction with the consent of the states concerned.
Now, if David was, now let's not go too far with the hypo. Go ahead. Never mind.
I don't think, unless I'm mistaken, I don't think I hit your car or any car, but it's, so, however, there's a real question about the extent to which adjudication of that sort plays an important role in the climate regime. If you notice, I didn't mention the role of courts, at least not international courts. But the International Court of Justice does have an environmental chamber, which has been used on occasion. It has dealt with some international environmental disputes, a very big one involving whaling in the Antarctic.
That's right.
It was New Zealand and Australia and New Zealand, I believe, against Japan, where the complaining parties, Australia and New Zealand, won. Again, that's part of the larger mobilization of shame, or the naming and shaming. Can't necessarily force Japan or any other state to do something that it otherwise would not do. On the other hand, adding the additional layer that this action is not just poorly advised, but also illegal, tends to create additional pressure in the system. So the old Kyoto, getting back to the analogy to Kyoto, yes, Kyoto was a tougher agreement. It had more infrastructure, it had more texture to it. And in fact, there was a very, and I say was because it's no longer in force as of January 1st of this year. it has expired basically, but there was an adjudicatory mechanism. There was an adjudication that was initiated against Canada. Canada, as you may know, is exploiting tar sands in Alberta, which require a very great deal of energy to extract. And so Canada was not meeting its Kyoto targets. Canada, in fact, withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol as a result of that. Now, the way I was trained was that, contrary to what you might think, I mean, Susan, if she sues me in the courts of Massachusetts, she wants a check. She wants me to pay. But maybe if you're talking about states rather than individuals, maybe that's not such a bad result. Canada admitted that it could not meet its commitments. During the vice presidential debate last year, one of the vice presidential nominees analogized international relations. Well, it's kind of like people. Well, yes, to some extent, but to some extent not. And so what we have to do, and I say this to the audience, for you as the next generation of lawyers, as the next generation of professionals, as the next generation of students, as the next generation of citizens, have to come up with creative ways to make these systems go in a difficult environment. You may not be able to sue in the courts of Massachusetts. And so we have to be even more creative. That's the challenge for you as the next generation of practitioners in this field. And I say that not just to lawyers, but to scientists, to people in every discipline. How are we going to organize the world in a way that works for the ecosystem, in a way that works for the climate, in a way that works for human beings? So yes, there is a role for adjudication, but probably less than you might think in a domestic legal system.
So David, how do we organize ourselves in a way that works for the world? I think that's a wonderful way to conclude today's webinar.
Well, as Susan said when she introduced me, I've spent a good portion of my career working on these international environmental agreements, and in fact, for some different portions of it, actually negotiating them. What I have seen uniformly is that the instruments that are produced reflect political will. The first and necessary step is to mobilize that political will. And after that, the institutions, the structures tend to fall in place. As lawyers, we oftentimes make the mistake of thinking about it backwards. What are the institutions? How do we get them moving in a way that gets states to do things that they don't necessarily want to do? That's important. That's our job as lawyers. On the other hand, it's critically important to engage everybody on the planet in this, what is literally a global war, very much analogous to the COVID situation. The only difference being the time frame.
Susan, é muito essa mensagem final que o professor David traz de uma guerra global, da necessidade de envolvimento de todos, a participação de equipes multidisciplinares no enfrentamento da questão ambiental, e que sejamos mais criativos para encontrar soluções. Isso realmente nos traz esse grande desafio, e especialmente porque isso, o futuro da própria existência humana depende da participação de todos. So I would like to say thank you so much, Professor David, for lighting up all those questions, and for us to think about. We must be more creative to change this, and to do, because if we are not able to put an end in this is going to be an end for everybody. So we are inside of this, everybody, not only us today, but the future generation too. So this is something very strong, and a global war, as you said, Susan.
So, Pedro, thank you for calling on me for a second, because you said something that lit me up. which is future generations. And I think of the statement made by the first peoples of many of our indigenous lands in the Americas, North and South. They considered themselves custodians of the land for future generations. And in fact, they said, don't do anything that could impact 7 generations beyond us. And if we thought about our actions in that way, we would save a tremendous amount of suffering in the world, and not just global environmental, but global spiritual suffering and global physical suffering and many other impacts that we are so desensitized to because we've committed so many of these acts without thinking, without mindfulness, that we're not even sensitized to their loss. And Professor Wirth's words will ring in my ears for a very long time to come, especially 2030. My son wears a T-shirt that says he's graduating from the Natick school system in 2031. And I think about this idea of 2031 as being very far away from right now. But in fact, based on everything urgently that Professor Wirth has said, I think it's actually coming upon us very quickly, and there's no time to waste. Other than that, I just wanted to also acknowledge that we've had over 400 participants tonight in these 2 hours. And even though we do our best, Pedro, to keep it at about an hour and a half to an hour, we are always at 2 hours. So I think, we should just commit to that, right?
Yes.
How does everybody feel? Are you happy that you're here for 2 hours? Let's see it in the chat. Should we have stopped a half an hour ago or an hour ago, or should we have kept on going? I see Andre Felipe Barros Soares. Yes, of course. Yes. Good, because I'm glad you are, because you are what make these programs real for us. Without you, we would just be having a dinner together complaining about the situation of the world. And instead, we are mobilizing, and we hope that you feel mobilized, and that tomorrow, I want everyone here to commit to do 3 things that is better for the environment than you would have otherwise have done. So I don't care how big or small those 3 things are. I don't care if it's take a can and put it in the right place, or make your coffee at home instead of buying it outside, or whatever it is you do. Pick 3 things to do differently tomorrow, and you will have made a difference. And then from that day forward, add more. And, to me, I think that that's the purpose of these webinars, Pedro, is that we're not just doing this to talk. We're doing this to create action. We started during a pandemic. We talked about pandemic. We talked about racial justice in America. We talked about how business navigates an unclear landscape. Last week, we talked about cybersecurity. This week, we're talking about the environment. In 2 weeks, we'll be talking about the unjustly detained. So for all of these, we hope you appreciate it. We hope you will think about the Insights program that we're going to have in the first week of August, the 9th to the 13th, not to be missed. And of course, we hope you will think about joining us for future webinars. Some of you have asked, and Professor Wirth has very generously offered to share his slides. Of course, those of you who have participated, Pedro will explain the certification process.
Oh, yes. Yes, Susan. As we explained it last week, tomorrow we are going to send one email to everybody that was here alive, and you are able to go to a specific link we are sending to you tomorrow, and then you can generate your certificate. I saw a lot of people saying that they were very happy. They worked very well last week, Susan. We have very few people complaining about the wrong or the spelling of the name. That's why people are very aware when they are making the enrollment to write correctly their names. So it's been it's been perfect, the generation of the certificate. So once again, I would like to say thank you so much, Susan, because you are responsible to have the approval of Boston College Law School to certificate our friends that are here. So thank you so much for these, and also Professor David. Uh, I was reading your curriculum vitae, and it's impressive. It's amazing. It's incredible, and especially that you have your qualification as a chemistry and now working in the law field. So this is amazing. So thank you so much for being to be here with us, sharing a knowledge of a life. So we are very happy, and once again the chat is flying,
I know.
and people are saying thank you so much for being here, Professor David, Susan, and okay, Professor David, and if you want to say something.
Final words to Professor Wirth before we
Yes.
close down. And then just a reminder to everybody that we do not have a webinar next week, but Pedro and I may have an Instagram surprise for you. So,
Susan, I think I have here. Susan,
see.
before we move on, I think I have here already. Oh no, no, maybe it's better tomorrow to see if everything is going to be okay with the certificate. I may post on Instagram to the link, and on my on my channel on Telegram. So follow, and then you are going to get one email from the Zoom sending you to go to this page. Professor David, do you want to say something? Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you, Professor David.
Obrigado.
Well, I'm overwhelmed by the reception. Thank you so much for staying for 2 hours, for the questions, and I couldn't ask for a better audience. It's really been a pleasure and an honor and a privilege to be able to work with you this evening.
Pleasure
Okay.
is ours, darling.
Thank you so much.
Boa noite a todos. Boa noite.
Boa noite. Muito obrigado, gente. Foi sensacional.